call him Yo-Yo. He weighs 427 pounds.
Everybody take the peasants. Things were better.
Remember those flashy 70s TV shows that seemed destined to be hits until they vanished almost overnight? Back then, these huge flops were hyped in living rooms everywhere, promising the next big thing before fading into static. What really made them sink so fast? It is hard to believe that in the last year of the decade, someone looked at the incredible success of the Love Boat and decided that the only logical step was to take that exact formula, throw it on rails, and crank the budget up to levels that would give an accountant nightmares. That is how we ended up with Supertrain in 1979, a series that managed to be both ambitious and almost instantly doomed. The premise sounded like television gold at the time. A massive, nuclear-powered train traveling coast to coast at speeds that made you wonder if the writers had ever opened a physics book, all while hosting romantic escapades, comedic hijinks, and melodrama from a revolving cast of guest stars. This was not just a train in the practical sense either. It had swimming pools, shopping centers, a disco, and cabins bigger than most New York City apartments. It was a dream cruise ship squeezed onto a track, and it cost a fortune to make every single frame of it. The network behind it, National Broadcasting Company, believed they were creating their own golden goose that would run forever, not realizing they were more or less hurling sacks of money directly into a furnace. The set alone was a monster. Engineers and builders had to design and construct full-sized rail cars with working interiors, and because this was 1979, there was no quick computer graphics solution to fake the movement or environment. Huge sound stages were converted into train corridors. Miniature models were made for exterior shots, but they had to be meticulously detailed so the audience would believe the thing actually existed. The production schedule was relentless and expensive, with rumors swirling at the time that the cost of each episode could have funded an entire season of another primetime drama. Yet, for all that spending, the problem was the storylines themselves. Instead of capturing lightning in a bottle the way the Love Boat did, Supertrain's plots were paper-thin and often bizarre. One week, you might get a light-hearted romantic comedy between two passengers. The next week would throw in a corporate espionage thriller. The tonal whiplash was hard to follow, and the rotating guest star gimmick could not save it. Even with names like Zsa Zsa Gabor and Rue McClanahan making appearances, there was no way to make the dialogue land when everything felt like a recycled soap opera scene. Viewers tuned in for the premiere out of curiosity, then slowly vanished when they realized the spectacle of the train was the only consistently interesting thing on the screen. By the time National Broadcasting Company executives realized the ratings were slipping faster than a dining car plate on a sharp turn, it was too late. Advertising revenue did not match the astronomical production costs, and the show's reputation had already started to shift from innovative to disastrous. Just 9 episodes aired before it was pulled off the track for good, making it one of the most expensive flops of the decade. The network reportedly took a huge financial hit, and it became a cautionary tale for how not to launch a prestige project. What makes Supertrain fascinating in hindsight is how it represents that unique mix of 1970s optimism and complete lack of restraint. The idea that bigger was always better collided headfirst with the reality of network television budgets and audience patience. It was the kind of project that could only have been greenlit in an era where executives still believed that spending more meant automatically getting better results. In a way, Supertrain did not just derail itself, it helped mark the end of an era where networks would gamble so recklessly on such massive single-location sets. Today, it is remembered more as a punchline in television history than for any actual episode, but for those who caught it during its brief run, it is a reminder of the kind of bold missteps that could only come from the tail end of the 1970s. Turn On, in 1970, is what happens when a network tries to leap onto a trend without stopping to consider that maybe, just maybe, some ideas do not translate to the mainstream. Imagine a sketch comedy show built on rapid-fire jokes, surreal humor, and electronic editing tricks, all designed to be hip and cutting-edge, but with none of the charm or grounding that made Laugh-In work. That is essentially what Turn On was, and it remains one of the fastest canceled shows in American television history. The concept was sold as being revolutionary, a program with no sets, no traditional transitions, just wall-to-wall gags stitched together with quick cuts and animated inserts, almost like flipping through a magazine at high speed. The problem was that instead of feeling clever, it felt like television had been hijacked by a robot with a bad sense of humor. The pace was relentless to the point of exhaustion. Sketches were often just a few seconds long, featuring bizarre, sometimes risque punchlines that came out of nowhere. Instead of a laugh track, the show used strange sound effects, early computer graphics, and jarring musical cues. The producers wanted it to feel of the moment, reflecting the counterculture vibe of the time. But what actually came across was an almost alienating, machine-like parody of humor. Television stations in some markets famously pulled the plug during the very first broadcast, refusing to air the second half of the episode because they found it offensive, confusing, or both. Part of the issue was timing. America in 1970 was in a complicated place culturally. Audiences were still adjusting to the shifting boundaries of comedy, and while edgier shows like Laugh-In had succeeded by blending innuendo with wit, Turn On went straight for shock value without giving viewers any characters or running gags to connect with. The cold, almost clinical presentation made it feel like satire without a point of view, which is a dangerous place for comedy to live. Worse still, the very network that approved it seemed to have second thoughts the moment the first wave of complaints rolled in. Stations that did air the full premiere were met with immediate backlash from both viewers and sponsors, many of whom declared they would never support the program. The cast and writers, some of whom went on to have successful careers elsewhere, were left blindsided. They had been told they were working on the next big thing in sketch comedy, a show that would redefine the medium, only to have it implode in less than 24 hours. Industry gossip at the time claimed the crew only learned about the cancellations by reading the trades the next morning. In an era where even mediocre shows could limp along for a full season before being axed, Turn On's swift death was practically unheard of. In hindsight, there is a small cult fascination with Turn On, largely because so little of it survives. Only fragments and a handful of stills exist, making it more of a television urban legend than an accessible artifact. For those who do manage to track down a copy of the pilot, the experience is more like watching an experimental art piece than a network comedy. It is jarring, awkward, and occasionally baffling, but it is also a rare glimpse into how wildly networks were willing to experiment at the dawn of the 1970s, sometimes with disastrous results. In the end, Turn On is remembered less for its content than for how quickly it vanished, a one-night misfire that proved not all risks pay off, even in the anything-goes atmosphere of early 70s television. The Brady Bunch Hour in 1976 to 1977 is one of those rare cases where a beloved property takes such a hard left turn that audiences are left blinking at the screen, wondering if they are being pranked. The original Brady Bunch had already wrapped up its wholesome suburban adventures a couple of years earlier, and reruns were still keeping the characters alive in the minds of viewers. But someone, somewhere in network decision-making land, decided the Bradys should not just come back. They should come back as a variety show. Picture it. The entire Brady clan singing, dancing, and performing comedy sketches, complete with sequined costumes, elaborate sets, and musical numbers that would not be out of place in a Vegas revue. The result was surreal, even by mid-1970s television standards. The concept was that the Bradys were now a traveling family variety act, much like the Osmonds or the Jacksons, with Father Mike and Mother Carol leading the kids through choreographed numbers and banter. There were colorful backdrops, big band-style arrangements, and guests ranging from high-profile entertainers to novelty acts that barely anyone remembered the next day. It was a sharp departure from the gentle domestic humor of the original series. Gone were the modest living room scenes and family problem-solving. Instead, we had disco-inspired medleys and skits that felt hastily written to tie into whatever the guest star's specialty was. The production went all in on the spectacle. Glitter, flashing lights, and over-the-top costumes became the norm. There were entire sequences where the cast would perform synchronized water ballets in a giant pool or attempt complicated dance routines while belting out popular hits of the day. For actors who had built their careers on playing a relatable, down-to-earth family, the transition was jarring. Some adapted better than others, but not even the most enthusiastic performance could cover up the awkwardness of watching Marcia and Greg suddenly trying to pull off variety show patter. One of the most talked-about aspects of the Brady Bunch hour was how aggressively it clung to the 1970s aesthetic. The music leaned heavily into disco beats and brassy arrangements, and the outfits, polyester jumpsuits, sequins, flared pants, were pure time capsule. For anyone who stumbled across the show years later, it was almost like finding a parody of a 1970s variety special, except this one had the full endorsement of a major network. The ratings started out respectable, driven by curiosity and the lingering affection for the Brady name. But as the novelty wore off, so did the audience's patience. The variety format itself was on the decline, with audiences shifting towards sitcoms, dramas, and game shows. And for fans of the original Brady Bunch, the disconnect between the old format and this new, flashy experiment was too much. Critical reception was brutal, with many reviewers calling it a misguided attempt to cash in on nostalgia without understanding what made the original work. It did not take long before the plug was pulled. Still, in the years since, the Brady Bunch Hour has taken on a kind of cult status. For those who love kitschy so-bad-it-is-good television, it is a treasure trove of awkward sketches, gaudy production numbers, and unintentional comedy. It stands as a reminder of how quickly networks were willing to twist a successful brand into something unrecognizable in the hope of catching a passing trend. The Bradys may have survived countless family dramas on their original show, but even they could not sing and dance their way out of this one. If you want a case study in how not to launch a sitcom, Coed Fever in 1979 is hard to beat. It was conceived as part of the brief, ill-fated wave of television comedies inspired by the huge box office success of Animal House in 1978. The logic from network executives seemed simple enough. Take the raucous, raunchy college humor that audiences were loving in theaters, clean it up just enough for prime time, and rake in the ratings. But what they got was a show that was neither outrageous enough to match its inspiration, nor funny enough to stand on its own. And in one of television's most embarrassing debuts, Coed Fever was canceled after a single airing. The setup revolved around Baxter College, an all-girls school that had just gone co-ed. Cue the predictable premise: a sudden influx of male students, culture clashes, romantic mishaps, and all these zany misunderstandings that could arise from such a change. The cast was filled with fresh-faced actors, many of whom would go on to better things. But here they were stuck delivering punchlines that felt like they had been recycled from rejected pilot scripts of the early 1970s. The humor relied heavily on innuendo, slapstick, and the kind of gender stereotypes that were already starting to feel outdated. The pilot episode, which ended up being the only episode, was a mess of tone and pacing. There were attempts at outrageous comedy, such as pratfalls, awkward romantic encounters, and over-the-top misunderstandings about dorm arrangements, but it all landed with a thud. The writing tried to suggest a college environment brimming with energy and sexual tension, but network restrictions meant anything truly edgy was off-limits. The result was a strange middle ground, too tame to shock, too clumsy to charm. Even the production seemed uncertain about what it wanted to be. Some scenes had the laugh track and three-camera setup of a traditional sitcom, while others tried for more of a loose, chaotic feel. This inconsistency only highlighted how unsure the creators were about their target audience. Meanwhile, critics were merciless. Reviews called it juvenile, unfunny, and a blatant attempt to cash in on a hit movie without understanding why the movie worked. The backlash was swift. The premiere aired as a special Sunday night broadcast, and within hours the network reportedly decided not to proceed with the planned season. Some affiliates refused to air the show at all, sensing the disaster before it fully unfolded. In a particularly humiliating twist, Coed Fever's dormitory set did not even have time to be dismantled before it was repurposed for other, more successful productions. Over the years, Coed Fever has been remembered mostly as a trivia answer for shortest-lived network sitcoms and as a cautionary tale about chasing trends. It is one thing to try to bottle the lightning of a cultural phenomenon. It is another to misunderstand the storm entirely. Watching it now, if you can even find a copy, is like stepping into an alternate universe where every college comedy cliché is rolled into one half-hour, then abruptly yanked off the air before it can figure out what it is doing. In the crowded graveyard of 1970s television flops, Coed Fever still manages to stand out, not because it burned brightly, but because it barely flickered before disappearing. Pink Lady and Jeff in 1979 is the kind of television experiment that could only have been born from a combination of desperation, optimism, and a complete misunderstanding of its own premise. On paper, it sounded novel enough. Pair a rising American comedian with a famous Japanese pop duo, let them sing, dance, and tell jokes, and wrap the whole thing in the glittering shell of a variety show. The problem, and it was a glaring one, was that the two worlds never actually fit together in any natural way. Pink Lady, made up of Me and Kay, were genuine superstars in Japan, known for catchy pop hits and polished stage presence. Jeff Altman was a stand-up comic with a sarcastic offbeat style. Put together, it was less a collaboration and more like two entirely different shows accidentally airing at the same time. One of the first things that baffled audiences was that Pink Lady did not speak English fluently, yet the format required them to banter with Jeff in front of a live audience. Most of their interactions were scripted phonetically, and you could see the strain as they tried to deliver lines without fully understanding the jokes. Meanwhile, Jeff would mug for the camera, toss in American cultural references, and often end up carrying entire scenes by himself. The humor gap between the performers was massive, and it became obvious that no amount of musical sparkle could bridge it. The variety show segments themselves were a strange patchwork. One minute, Pink Lady would be performing a fully choreographed disco pop number with backup dancers in shiny costumes. The next minute, Jeff would be doing a stand-up routine about American politics or a sketch about small-town life. Musical guests appeared, but they often seemed randomly selected, as if the producers were throwing everything at the wall to see what might stick. Some of the more surreal moments included awkward comedy sketches in which Me and Kay were clearly unsure of what was happening, yet still gamely going along with the act. It did not help that by 1979, the variety show genre was already dying on network television. Audience tastes had shifted towards sitcoms, dramas, and shows with more cohesive storytelling. Pink Lady and Jeff arrived not only at the tail end of the variety boom, but also as an example of the genre at its most chaotic. Viewers who tuned in out of curiosity often left with more questions than laughs. Who was this for? Why did these segments feel like they were stitched together from leftover ideas of other programs? And most importantly, why did no one on screen seem entirely comfortable with what they were doing? Critics wasted no time piling on. Reviews called it tone-deaf, disjointed, and a variety show without variety. The awkward language barrier became a frequent punchline in itself, overshadowing whatever actual comedy or music the show was trying to deliver. Ratings dropped quickly, and the network pulled the plug after just 6 episodes. The failure was so glaring that it became shorthand in the industry for mismatched pairings and poor concept execution. Yet for all its flaws, Pink Lady and Jeff has developed a certain kitsch appeal over the years. The sheer oddity of its premise, combined with the undeniable commitment of its performers, makes it fascinating to revisit. In a way, it is a reminder that the late 1970s were still a time when networks would gamble big on risky, even baffling ideas, hoping to find a breakout hit. This one just happened to crash spectacularly, leaving behind a legacy of confusion, glitter, and missed connections. Holmes and YoYo in 1976 was one of those high-concept sitcoms that seemed destined to either become a cult classic or vanish into the void. And it chose the void. The premise was straightforward but undeniably odd. A straight-laced police detective named Holmes is assigned a new partner, YoYo, who turns out to be an experimental android designed to assist in investigations. This was not a gritty sci-fi procedural, though. It was a light-hearted buddy comedy in which YoYo's robotic quirks caused endless misunderstandings, pratfalls, and sight gags. Imagine if The Odd Couple had one of the leads replaced with a malfunctioning toaster, and you are not far off. From the very first episode, the show leaned heavily into physical comedy. YoYo would misinterpret Holmes's instructions, get stuck repeating phrases, or accidentally reveal his robotic nature in front of suspects. His chest could print out mugshots and case details like a human-sized office machine. He could record conversations and play them back in strange, tinny tones. He also had a habit of breaking down at inconvenient moments, which usually meant steam, sparks, and exaggerated flailing. The laugh track worked overtime to assure you these were all hilarious. But even in the forgiving world of 1970s sitcoms, the gags quickly grew repetitive. The chemistry between the two leads was meant to be the heart of the series. Richard B. Schull, as Holmes, played the exasperated straight man, constantly trying to keep cases on track while covering for his unpredictable partner. John Schuck, as YoYo, committed fully to the role, with stiff movements and a wide-eyed innocence that was supposed to contrast with Holmes's weary pragmatism. And to their credit, they did what they could with the material, but the scripts rarely rose above broad slapstick and predictable setups. One week, YoYo might accidentally arrest the wrong person. The next, he would blow his cover by speaking fluent computer in front of a crowd. What made Holmes and YoYo stand out, for better or worse, was how seriously it seemed to take its own absurdity. The show did not wink at the audience or lean into parody. It presented its premise as if it were perfectly reasonable that a police department would assign a robot partner to an unsuspecting human officer. The result was a tonal mismatch, too silly for crime show fans, too slow for kids looking for quick laughs, and too niche for the general sitcom audience. Production values did not help. The special effects used to show YoYo's abilities were modest even by mid-1970s standards. Scenes that required robotic tricks often relied on obvious props, awkward cuts, or cheap visual overlays. While some of this low-tech charm might appeal to retro television enthusiasts today, at the time it only reinforced the perception that the show was flimsy and undercooked. Critics were not kind. Many dismissed it as a one-joke premise stretched far beyond its limits, and audiences seemed to agree. Ratings were poor from the start, and the show was quietly removed from the schedule before its first season could even fully air. It disappeared so quickly that many viewers never even knew it existed until it began popping up on worst TV shows lists decades later. Looking back, Holmes and YoYo is a curious artifact of its time, a reminder of the 1970s fascination with futuristic gimmicks mixed into everyday settings. It tried to merge the police procedural format with lighthearted sci-fi comedy, but the two halves never gelled. In the end, it is remembered less for any particular episode and more for its premise alone. The short-lived tale of a cop and his clumsy android partner patrolling the streets and the edges of plausibility until they both ran out of power. The Man from Atlantis in 1977 to 1978 is one of those shows that feels like it was built entirely around a single image, a mysterious man with webbed hands and feet swimming gracefully through the ocean like a human dolphin. That man was played by Patrick Duffy, long before his Dallas fame, and his character, Mark Harris, was supposed to be the last survivor of the lost civilization of Atlantis. He was discovered washed ashore, suffering from amnesia, and taken in by a foundation that specialized in oceanographic research. From there, every week brought a new underwater adventure, usually involving scientific mysteries, sea creatures, or megalomaniacal villains with elaborate plans. The hook, of course, was Mark's Atlantean abilities. He could breathe underwater, withstand crushing depths, and swim at incredible speeds using a distinctive dolphin-like motion that the show showcased in slow-motion shots. On land, though, he was vulnerable, which meant there were plenty of moments where he would dramatically collapse in the desert sun or gasp for air far from the shore. The mix of superhero-style powers and fish-out-of-water awkwardness was meant to be compelling, and sometimes it was, at least when the effects could keep up. The series started with several made-for-television movies that did well enough to get the green light for a full season. The problem was that the premise, while unique, was not deep enough to sustain weekly episodes without drifting into formula. Many plots boiled down to Mark investigating a strange occurrence at sea, encountering some sort of threat, and then saving the day through a combination of underwater stunts and quiet moral wisdom. The production also struggled with the limitations of shooting underwater sequences on a television budget. The novelty of the swimming shots wore off quickly when they began to look the same from week to week. Critics were divided. Some praised its environmental themes and earnestness, while others saw it as a slow, repetitive curiosity that never fully capitalized on its potential. By the end of its run, it was clear that The Man from Atlantis was destined to be more of a cult memory than a mainstream success. Today, it is fondly remembered by those who grew up watching it, partly because there has never been anything quite like it on television again. The Oregon Trail. In 1977 was an ambitious attempt to turn a slice of American history into a weekly primetime drama. Set in the mid-19th century, it followed a wagon train of settlers heading west in search of new lives. Leading them was Captain Evan Thorpe, played by Rod Taylor, a widower traveling with his two young sons. The premise promised sweeping landscapes, rugged frontier challenges, and the kind of survival drama that could tap into the pioneer spirit. The trouble was that it arrived at a time when the appetite for westerns was already fading, and it never managed to stand out in a crowded television landscape. From the start, The Oregon Trail leaned heavily on the episodic perils of the week format. One week might bring a violent storm that threatened to scatter the wagons. The next might see conflicts with outlaws or tense encounters with Native American tribes, written through the lens of 1970s network television sensibilities. There were occasional forays into personal drama, budding romances, moral dilemmas, or disagreements over leadership. But these often felt like filler between action beats. The show wanted to balance grit and family-friendly appeal, but in doing so, it often dulled the edges of both. Visually, it had moments of beauty. Filming on location gave it some cinematic sweep, with wide shots of wagon trains against open plains. But the scale was always limited by budget, and action scenes could feel small compared to the big-screen westerns audiences were used to. Performances were solid, with Rod Taylor bringing a steady gravitas to the lead role, yet the scripts rarely gave the cast material that felt fresh or urgent. By the late 1970s, television had already shifted toward modern dramas, sitcoms, and more experimental storytelling, leaving traditional Western fare at a disadvantage. The Oregon Trail aired only a handful of episodes before being canceled, with some installments never even making it to air in the United States. While it may have been an earnest effort to keep the Western alive, it ended up as a quiet footnote in television history. For the few who remember it, the series stands as a reminder that even with good intentions and decent production values, sometimes the cultural moment has simply moved on. When Things Were Rotten in 1975 was Mel Brooks doing what Mel Brooks does best, taking a familiar story and gleefully tearing it apart with rapid-fire gags. This time, the target was the legend of Robin Hood, except instead of noble archery and daring heroics, viewers got pratfalls, wordplay, and jokes so fast you could miss them if you blinked. Starring Dick Gautier as a dim yet dashing Robin, the series threw historical accuracy out the window in favor of absurd anachronisms, breaking the fourth wall and undercutting every traditional heroic moment with a punchline. The merry men bumbled through their adventures. Maid Marian was a little sharper than anyone else, and the Sheriff of Nottingham was more bumbling bureaucrat than terrifying villain. The humor was unapologetically silly, filled with running gags, corny one-liners, and sight jokes that would be right at home in Brooks's films. Scenes might start like a classic swashbuckling rescue only to veer into banter about bad medieval plumbing or odd food choices. For comedy fans, it was a breezy, joke-a-minute romp. For others, it was chaotic and perhaps too self-aware for its own good. The problem was timing. Airing in the mid-1970s, When Things Were Rotten landed in a comedy landscape shifting toward more grounded sitcoms and social commentary. Its brand of relentless, gag-driven humor was seen as old-fashioned by some critics despite its sharpness. Ratings started low and never recovered, leading to a swift cancellation after just 13 episodes. Still, for the small audience that embraced it, the show was pure joy. An unapologetic spoof that did not care if the laughs came from clever wordplay or someone falling face-first into a moat. Years later, Brooks would return to Robin Hood with his film Men in Tights, proving he still thought the legend was ripe for ridicule. Far Out Space Nuts in 1975 was Saturday morning television at its most delightfully absurd. Starring Bob Denver, fresh off his run as Gilligan, and Chuck McCann, it followed two bumbling NASA maintenance workers who accidentally launched themselves into space after pressing the wrong button. The premise alone set the tone. This was not hard science fiction, but broad slapstick comedy in a sci-fi wrapper. Each episode had the duo stranded on a different alien world, running into strange creatures, oddball civilizations, and the occasional low-budget menace that looked suspiciously like a recycled costume from another show. The humor leaned heavily on physical comedy and silly misunderstandings. Denver played his familiar, well-meaning but clueless persona, while McCann brought big, boisterous energy as his equally accident-prone partner. Together, they stumbled through outer space with the same hopeless charm that had worked for other television duos. Except here, the backdrop was painted starfields and foam rock landscapes. There was an infectious innocence to it, the kind of show where you could tell everyone involved knew it was goofy and leaned into it. Visually, it was pure 1970s Saturday morning. Bright colors, obvious sets, and creature designs that mixed creativity with budget constraints. Despite its lighthearted appeal, Far Out Space Nuts only lasted one season. Competition for children's attention was fierce, and shows with stronger merchandising hooks often won the day. Still, it remains fondly remembered by those who caught it during its brief run. In an era when many children's shows were taking themselves a little too seriously, this one proudly embraced its own silliness, sending two lovable goofs bumbling across the galaxy without ever losing its playful spirit. If you enjoyed this trip through television's most spectacular faceplants, drop your favorite forgotten flop in the comments, give that like button a little primetime love, and subscribe so you never miss another rerun of TV history's weirdest moments.